The dinner had begun like every other family celebration, with crystal glasses, soft jazz, and a smell of sugar and perfection. My mother believed in appearances the way some people believed in God. Every plate, every napkin, every person at that table existed to complete her picture of control. Even the dessert, her famous caramel tarts, gleamed under the chandelier like trophies. We were 5 people that night, my parents, my older brother, his wife, and me. The table stretched longer than our conversations ever did. And when my mother lifted her wine glass to make a toast, I expected another polished speech about family, gratitude, success. But what came out instead changed everything. She smiled, that perfect, rehearsed smile, and said, almost playfully, "I wish you were never born." The room went silent for a heartbeat. Then laughter filled it. My brother laughed first, too loud. His wife followed, eyes darting nervously toward me. Even my father chuckled, the sound hollow and weary. Everyone laughed, except me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The words hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had just been snuffed out. For them, it was a joke. For me, it was a confession. The chandelier above flickered, and for a moment, her reflection shimmered across the wine glass in front of me, the image of a woman who debuilt everything she ever wanted, except a family she could love. The dessert cooled untouched on my plate, and something inside me, something quiet long buried, began to wake. After dinner, my mother disappeared into her world of perfection. She floated from guest to guest, checking napkin folds, rearranging candles, complimenting herself through others. The woman everyone admired had no sharp edges, unless you lived inside her home. To the outside world, she was a philanthropist, a real estate visionary, the woman who turned vacant lots into million-dollar neighborhoods. To me, she was the architect of guilt. Every corner of our mansion whispered her control, from the imported marble floors to the framed awards that lined the hallway. They were all built on the same foundation: appearances. That night, I wandered into my father's old study, the only room she never bothered to redecorate. It still smelled of ink and oak, filled with blueprints of developments he and my mother had built decades ago. Their empire began with one plot of land, then grew into a network of communities that bore our family name. The Caro Estate Group, a dynasty of property, wealth, and control. My father had built the foundation, my mother expanded it, and I was the invisible heir they wished had never existed. On the desk lay an open ledger, thick pages filled with figures, contracts, and signatures. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. It was dated years ago, months before his death. The entries stopped suddenly, replaced by my mother's neater, colder pen. Every transaction after that shifted money into a new entity I'd never seen before. Caro Holdings, Private. Something about that name caught me. It wasn't just another business. It was a vault, one she had created after my father's passing, cutting everyone else out, including me. I remembered the will, how quickly it had been read, how calmly she declared there was nothing left to divide, how I'd believed her because she made it sound logical, professional, final. But seeing those ledgers now, I realized she hadn't just divided the inheritance, she had rewritten it. I flipped through more pages: land transfers, shell companies, properties renamed and resold within days. The paper trail was messy but deliberate, the kind of mess made to confuse anyone who looked too closely. My pulse quickened as the realization grew sharper. She had stolen my father's legacy right in front of me. And the joke she'd made over dessert, "I wish you were never born," wasn't a cruelty. It was relief. Because if I'd never been born, there would have been no one left to challenge her. For the first time in years, anger didn't scare me. It steadied me, like cold water over fire. I spent the next few nights going through every file I could find. The mansion's office was a museum of secrets, drawers filled with contracts, photographs, old trust documents. I learned that my mother had built her philanthropy on foundation funds drawn from the same estates she claimed had been sold for charity. She turned compassion into currency. Every ribbon-cutting ceremony, every community project, it was all funded with money that was never hers to keep. And every time my brother smiled beside her at those events, I wondered how much he knew. He had always been her mirror, polished, obedient, rewarded for his resemblance, while I'd been her reminder that perfection had a cost. The more I read, the clearer it became. My father had left behind not just land, but a promise. Buried among the legal jargon was a clause, small, unassuming, almost hidden. In the event of irregularity, the estate's secondary beneficiary retains investigative rights. That beneficiary was me. She hadn't erased me. She just hoped I'd never look. That night, I drove to one of the first properties my parents ever built, the Amberwood Residences. It was a gated community now, the kind of place my mother's brochures still boasted about. Perfect lawns, symmetrical houses, streetlights glowing in coordinated warmth, every inch designed to feel safe. But as I stood outside the gates, staring at the sign with our family name engraved in gold, I felt only distance. Behind every perfect home here was someone like me, someone who didn't belong but pretended to. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of laughter from a backyard somewhere. The same kind of laughter that had filled our dining room when my mother humiliated me, except now it didn't sting. It clarified. I realized that the pain I carried wasn't rejection. It was inheritance, invisible, heavy, waiting to be claimed. The next day, I went to the bank listed in the ledgers, Stoneway Trust and Development. The same bank that had processed all of my mother's property transfers. In their public records, the accounts tied to Carroll Holdings were closed, but behind that closure, I could see patterns, transaction codes, timestamps, shell entities still active under different names. She had hidden her wealth not by burying it, but by disguising it as generosity. Each charity she founded had become a safe deposit box for her secrets. Each property donation, a money laundering transaction wrapped in good PR. That night, back in my car, I stared at the city skyline, every tower and light reflecting her shadow. For years I thought I was powerless. Now I understood I wasn't powerless. I was patient. There's a difference between being ignored and being underestimated, and my mother had done both. She thought I would stay quiet. She thought humiliation over dessert would keep me small, but it had done the opposite. It had given me a reason. That evening, I walked into the dining room again. The same chandelier glowed overhead. The same long table stretched between empty chairs. But now, I noticed something I never had before, a framed painting above the fireplace. It was a portrait of our family from years ago, before my father's death, before the perfection cracked. He stood between us, hand resting lightly on my shoulder, pride soft in his eyes. On the other side, my mother's smile was flawless, but cold, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the camera, on the audience, on the illusion. And then I noticed the edge of the frame uneven, as if something had been hidden behind it. I pulled it down carefully. Behind the canvas, taped to the wall, was a sealed envelope, brittle, yellowing, but still intact. Across it, written in my father's handwriting, were 3 words, "For my daughter." My throat tightened. The envelope had been here the whole time, hidden in plain sight, in the one room where my mother entertained the world. Inside were old photographs, a copy of his will, and a handwritten note. The note was brief, almost incomplete, but its last line was clear. If you're reading this, then she's built walls even I couldn't tear down. The key is in what she calls charity. I folded the paper slowly, the weight of his words pressing into my palm. The key is in what she calls charity. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was instruction. And it meant only one thing: the truth I needed was buried inside her own foundations. In the projects that carry her name. The community centers, the family shelters, the public gardens. The places she built to look good while hiding what she'd done. As the night deepened, I sat alone at the table, the candlelight flickering over untouched desserts still left from the evening's guests. My mother's words echoed faintly, "I wish you were never born." But now, they didn't sound cruel. They sounded scared. Because what she feared most wasn't my absence. It was my existence, the part of me that carried my father's mind and her ambition, sharpened by years of neglect. She had built an empire on lies. And now, her forgotten child had found the blueprint. Outside, the wind swept across the estate, rattling the windows like distant applause. The chandelier flickered once more, casting fractured light across the table. The caramel desserts gleamed under it, untouched, melting slowly into something unrecognizable. Tomorrow I will begin where my father's note had pointed me, her charities. The ones she built to sanctify herself. The ones that might finally expose her. The dinner was over, the laughter had died. But the inheritance of silence had just begun to speak. Morning crept over the Carroll estate like guilt wearing sunlight. By the time the first rays touched the marble terrace, the mansion was already awake with its rituals, maids polishing silver, gardeners whispering among roses that bloomed on borrowed soil. My mother had turned even dawn into ceremony. But that morning, the house didn't feel like hers anymore. It felt like evidence. The envelope from my father lay on my desk, its edges frayed by the night's rereading. His words echoed through every corridor. The key is in what she calls charity. I couldn't unhear them. They pulsed behind every polished smile in our family photographs. Charity, for my mother, was never kindness. It was camouflage. Her Carroll Foundation gleamed across the city community gardens, shelters, scholarship funds, each stamped with her initials in bronze. Reporters loved her. Politicians adored her. But every compliment they gave her, she'd built from something she'd quietly stolen. That morning, I opened her website and began tracing the addresses, 7 active foundations, 3 in development, all funded by private donors, all linked to parcels of land that once belonged to my father's original estate. She hadn't donated the family wealth, she had converted it. What the world saw as generosity was a legal transformation. Land turned to charity, then rezoned, resold, reborn as profit. I dressed carefully, plain clothes, invisible colors, and drove toward her newest project, the Haven Home for Families. A name that sounded merciful enough to earn wars. Its facade was perfect, white columns, fresh paint, flowers arranged in architectural symmetry. But perfection is a scent you recognize once you've lived inside its rot. I could already smell the deception beneath the lilies. Inside, staff greeted me with rehearsed warmth. Smiles curated for donors. They didn't know I was the daughter of the woman whose portrait hung above their reception desk. The plaque read, Founder and Visionary, Margaret Carroll. Her eyes followed me even from the frame, painted patience, eternal applause. I walked the halls pretending to admire the work. But behind every new coat of paint I saw missing invoices, forged signatures, misfiled deeds. The structure wasn't for families, it was a front for transfers. Her shelters were ghost properties, addresses used to launder trust funds through charitable exemptions. She had learned to turn compassion into tax relief, pity into power. Down a corridor marked, Staff Only, I found a door that led to the records room. Rows of binders lined the shelves, labeled with years and donor numbers. I traced my fingers along them until one binder caught my eye. 2016, the year my father died. Inside, every donation was signed by the same hand. Not my mother's, not my father's, mine. I froze. She had forged my name. The shock didn't burn, it chilled. She hadn't erased me from the legacy, she had used me to legitimize it. My supposed donations funded land transfers worth millions. Each transaction bore the phrase, Carroll Family Matching Gift. She had built her foundation on my false generosity, ensuring that even if anyone investigated, the blame would point back to me. I wasn't just the forgotten child anymore. I was the perfect scapegoat. The room swayed. I sat down, the binder heavy on my lap, the air thick with dust and betrayal. It wasn't anger that filled me this time. It was strategy. If she wanted me to be part of her fiction, then I'd use that fiction to undo her. I photographed every page, each forged signature, each falsified receipt. Evidence not just of greed, but of intent. In property law, intent is everything. My father had taught me that when I was 10, showing me how a misplaced signature could change the fate of land forever. Now, his lesson had returned as weapon. By the time I left the Haven home, the sun was lowering behind the skyline, turning the city gold, the same color as the plaques bearing my mother's name. The light made them shimmer like virtue. I knew better. They shimmered like warning signs. Back at the mansion, dinner was being prepared for another one of her gatherings, the donor appreciation night. Staff moved briskly under her command, placing crystal glasses beside plates that would taste of control. From the hallway, I watched her orchestrate everything, every flower, every candle, every person. To the world, she looked like grace. To me, she looked like architecture, beautiful, precise, empty. I slipped past them all and returned to my father's study. There, I spread the photos across the desk, aligning them beside the ledgers I found before. Together, they told a story even she couldn't rewrite, a story of wealth disguised as virtue, of a matriarch who had turned her own daughter into paperwork. Outside, laughter echoed from the dining hall. The same kind of laughter that had filled the air the night she said she wished I'd never been born. It no longer hurt. It only confirmed how unaware they were of the collapse already forming under their table. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the mansion sank into quiet, I opened the window. The garden below was glowing under soft floodlights, roses lined in perfect symmetry, each trimmed to identical height. My mother's garden, her miniature empire. But even gardens, I thought, depend on roots they can't see, and her roots were rotting. I spent the next several days tracing the rest of her charities. Each one was a mirror of the last. Beneath their compassion lay a ledger of deceit. One shelter had been built on land owned by her shell company. Another existed only on paper, its residents nothing more than names recycled from old donor lists. She had built an ecosystem of lies so intricate that even truth looked artificial beside it. In her world, morality was real estate. And love, if she ever felt it, was ownership. On the 5th day of my search, I visited the Carroll Children's Learning Center, her crown jewel of generosity. The building gleamed with glass walls and gold lettering. Inside, students recited lessons under the gaze of her portrait, their laughter echoing like innocence funded by theft. But behind the administration wing, I found a locked room, the kind marked maintenance, a janitor's closet supposedly. Yet the keyhole was digital, unusual for storage, too expensive for cleaning supplies. I waited until evening, when the halls emptied and the night security guard began his rounds. Then I returned with a copied key card, one ID discreetly borrowed from an office drawer earlier that day. The door opened with a quiet click. Inside was not a closet, it was an office. Small, windowless, humming with hidden servers. Rows of drives blinked faint blue light. Screens showed digital ledgers, databases, encrypted accounts, the real backbone of her empire. She hadn't just forged signatures, she digitized deception. Each charity was connected through a private server network labeled CF Legacy, CF Carroll Foundation. Legacy, her favorite word. On one monitor, a live balance flickered, offshore accounts tied to luxury developments under anonymous names. She was still moving money, still transferring properties, still growing richer even as her public image shone brighter with altruism. The realization felt surreal. My mother, who smiled at galas and kissed babies on camera, was the same woman who had turned philanthropy into profit at a scale my father could never have imagined. But there, buried among the folders, was one marked Vault 7 Reserved. The word vault froze me. It reminded me of the ledgers from my father's study, a hint that her methods might have roots deeper than even she admitted. I opened the file, encrypted, password required. Beside it, a date, the same date as my father's death. Whatever was inside that file wasn't business. It was confession. I copied everything to a drive and left the room before dawn. When the city woke, the sun rose over a world that still believed my mother's legend. But under that surface, I now held the truth. Her empire wasn't just corrupt. It was haunted by the man she'd replaced and a daughter she'd underestimated. That night, I sat again in the dining room where the words had been spoken, "I wish you were never born." The chandelier glowed softly above me, reflecting off the silverware she'd chosen for perfection. For the first time, I didn't feel small under it. I felt certain. Because every empire built on image eventually collapses under evidence. Tomorrow I would open Vault 7. Tomorrow I would find out what she'd hidden on the day my father died. Tomorrow, the laughter she weaponized would finally return to silence. Rain came down like static across the glass, soft but relentless. It blurred the skyline into watercolor shapes, dissolving towers that once looked untouchable. Somewhere inside that storm, my mother was probably sleeping soundly, unaware that her past had begun to unlock itself. The flash drive I'd stolen from her servers sat on my desk, small, harmless, glowing a single green light. It looked like any other piece of plastic, but I knew better. Inside it lived Vault 7, the file she'd sealed on the night my father died. For hours, I just stared at it. It wasn't fear keeping me still, it was calculation. Opening this file meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Once I saw what was inside, I never see my family the same way again. When I finally connected it to the laptop, the screen flared white. A prompt appeared, "Enter key." I tried the obvious dates, names, her initials. Nothing. Then I remembered my father's note. The key is in what she calls charity. So I typed Haven, the first shelter she'd built, the one hiding my forged signature. The screen flickered once, then unlocked. Dozens of folders unfolded across the screen, each labeled in my mother's meticulous style. Transfers, accounts, reports, health. And then one stood out personal. Inside were scanned letters, handwritten notes, and a video file. The timestamps matched the final weeks before my father's death. I opened the letters first. They weren't business correspondence. They were reports written by private doctors, lawyers, and consultants. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. My father's mental state had been declared unstable shortly before he signed the final version of his will. But the handwriting at the bottom of those reports wasn't the doctor's, it was hers. She had rewritten the evaluations, fabricated evidence of his decline, and used them to void his last testament. My father had tried to protect me with that will. She had rewritten it into his confession of incompetence. The screen dimmed for a moment as thunder cracked outside. When I reopened the next file, it was a scanned contract, one transferring Carroll Estate Group Holdings entirely into Carroll Holdings Private, the same entity she had built in secret. The signature line bore my father's name. But the date was wrong. He was already dead. It wasn't a transaction, it was a forgery. Each page was another nail in the foundation of her empire. Each signature another theft disguised as professionalism. And beneath it all, a thread ran constant, her hunger to own every last brick of the life he'd built. I clicked the video file. The screen filled with grainy footage of my father's study, the same room I'd been sitting in days earlier. He sat at the desk, thinner than I remembered, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. He looked toward the camera as if aware it was there, as if recording wasn't his idea. Then my mother entered the frame. Her voice was calm, calculated, her presence filling the space like a verdict. He handed her a document. She placed another in front of him. He hesitated. Her hand moved firm, guiding his pen. The pen touched paper. The moment froze. And the file ended there. I sat in silence, the rain outside matching the pulse in my ears. No dialogue, no violence. Just quiet manipulation, lethal in its simplicity. He hadn't signed away his empire willingly. He'd been directed into erasing himself. That was her true skill, not building property, but rewriting reality. She didn't destroy people. She redesigned them. I replayed the clip twice more, analyzing every frame. On the second viewing, I noticed a reflection in the desk's glass surface, another document lying underneath the one he de-signed. Its header was barely visible, but I could read part of it. Trust revision, secondary beneficiary. She hadn't just taken his signature, she had replaced the document itself. If that second paper still existed, it could undo everything she'd done. It would prove her fraud and restore the estate to its rightful line. To me, but I had no idea where she'd hidden it. I searched the remaining folders. In one labeled archive, I found a list of deposit boxes registered under aliases R. Marin, D. Lowell, C. Firth, names connected to her accountants and lawyers. Each box listed contents simply as trust documents. The last entry had a note. R11, discretion, destroy after audit. Dated the same week as my father's death. She hadn't destroyed it. She preserved it somewhere safe, somewhere untraceable. My father had always used codes for property lots. R11 could easily be a location, not a box. If it was, I knew where to look. Her old development project outside the city, the Ravenhill estate. That night, I drove through the rain-soaked highways until the city lights melted behind me. The road to Ravenhill was narrow and cracked, overgrown by vines reclaiming what money had abandoned. When I reached the gate, it hung half open, rust bleeding down its iron bars. A sign read, Future site of Ravenhill Park, a Carroll Foundation project. Construction had stopped years ago. Perfect place to hide something that needed to disappear. The main house stood unfinished concrete skeleton, glassless windows, rooms filled with the smell of dust and damp wood. I moved through it by flashlight, tracing my beam along bare walls until it hit something wrong, an outline too smooth for raw cement. A panel. Behind it, a small safe. Numbers carved faintly on the metal. R11. My heartbeat thudded through the silence. I used the same passcode she set on every other system. Her anniversary. The lock clicked. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a single folder. No jewelry, no cash, just paper. I opened it carefully, the edges crackling under my fingers. At the top, stamped in blue, Trust revision, secondary beneficiary. The document was real. My father's seal pressed into the corner, the ink of his signature still deep and original. And under beneficiary my name, not forged, not erased, still alive. For years she had told the world the inheritance was divided, the assets gone, the wealth redistributed. But here was proof that every stone, every estate, every foundation was meant to return to me. All of it. I sank to the floor, the paper trembling in my hands. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was sorrow, the kind that comes from realizing truth arrives too late for the person who wrote it. Outside, wind tore through the half-built walls, howling through hollow rooms like a warning. I knew what this document meant. It wasn't just inheritance. It was a weapon. And weapons, once unsheathed, draw blood. When I returned home, dawn had begun to climb the horizon. The mansion was still, but something felt off, the subtle disarray of a place that had been entered while you were gone. A faint scent of her perfume lingered in the hallway. On my desk, where the flash drive had been, there was only a note. 3 words, written in her immaculate cursive. You opened it. No threat. No panic, just acknowledgement. She knew. For a moment, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The empire she'd built was no longer her secret alone. It was shared between us now, mother and daughter, predator and heir. That day, she didn't confront me, she didn't have to. Her silence was heavier than accusation. It told me she was already calculating her next move. By evening, I began noticing small shifts, the family lawyer calling to check in, the foundation's social media accounts quietly deleting posts, her assistants shredding old files in the garage. She was cleaning house. But she didn't realize that I had something she couldn't delete, a hard copy, signed in ink, notarized under law, the true will. The one she'd buried in cement and concrete dreams. I hid it inside the walls of my father's study, sealing it behind the very bookshelf that once guarded his secrets. It felt poetic, the daughter restoring what the mother had stolen. That night, as the rain finally stopped, I stood by the window watching lights ripple across the garden. My mother's world still looked perfect from a distance, symmetry, wealth, applause. But beneath it, foundations had cracked. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like an outsider in her empire. I felt like its future. Yet deep inside, I sensed that she wasn't finished. She never lost control without taking something with her. The invitation arrived 3 days later. Thick cardstock, embossed letters, my mother's name gleaming in gold at the top. The Carroll Foundation, Annual Gala, an evening of legacy and vision. Her favorite words, legacy, vision, the two pillars she used to disguise everything she had destroyed. At first glance, it looked like another of her lavish spectacles, champagne, cameras, the illusion of generosity dressed as social duty. But I knew better. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Her way of reminding me that no matter what I had uncovered, she still owned the stage. The event was to be held at the Glass House Pavilion, one of the most exclusive venues in the city, a structure she'd funded herself years ago. Every beam, every pane of glass, every chandelier bore the invisible signature of her control. Now, she had chosen it as her battlefield. On the evening of the gala, the city glittered under drizzle, rain that wasn't enough to soak, just enough to shine. The driveway leading to the pavilion was lined with luxury cars and velvet ropes, the kind of glamour that made corruption look like achievement. Gases drifted inside like a tide of perfume and applause. Every name tag carried status. Every smile hid competition. And at the center of it all stood my mother. She looked ageless, elegance sculpted into human form. Her gown shimmered like a second skin, her jewelry catching the light just so. Around her, photographers circled like worshippers around an altar. Her laughter carried easily over the orchestra, light and effortless, the same sound that once made my father pause mid-sentence, the same one that had filled our dining room when she told me she wished I'd never been born. I watched from the edge of the room, unseen among the crowd. Her world had no room for shadows, yet I had become the only one she couldn't erase. The gala began with speeches, donors, board members, politicians who owed her favors they'd never repay. Every word was a brick in the wall of illusion she built around herself. She spoke last, her voice smooth and measured, the perfect blend of humility and dominance. As she thanked her beloved family for their support, I noticed something. Her gaze never once met mine. She wasn't ignoring me. She was performing control. Pretending I didn't exist was her favorite form of victory. But beneath the surface of her speech, something felt rehearsed, too careful. There was a tremor in her perfection, a pause too long between her sentences, a sign that even she felt the cracks widening. When the applause ended, the orchestra began again, and waiters glided across the floor carrying trays of champagne. Laughter filled the air like static. But behind the smiles, deals were being whispered, alliances negotiated, futures traded. It was less a celebration and more a marketplace, power disguised as philanthropy. I walked through the room quietly, observing the architecture she'd built. Not the walls, but the people. Each one a piece of her empire. A lawyer who handled her estates. A banker who approved her offshore accounts. A city council member who smoothed her zoning issues. Every handshake was a contract. Every compliment, a transaction. And yet there was something else in the air that night, anticipation. As though everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one could name it. Then I saw it, the projection screen at the back of the room, displaying a slideshow of her achievements. Photographs of her standing beside ribbon cuttings, shaking hands with mayors, smiling before the foundation's buildings. And then, as the slides transitioned, a new image appeared, unfamiliar to anyone except me. A document. Scanned. Official. The trust revision. My father's signature. My name beneath it. The room went still. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then whispers began, sharp, slicing, multiplying. The projection lingered on the image before fading to black. Applause stopped. Eyes turned. She stood frozen, the mask of grace slipping for the first time. I hadn't planned this. At least, not consciously, but someone else had helped it happen. On the corner of the screen, before it went dark, a watermark flashed briefly. Ravenhill Archives. It wasn't my doing. It was Harland, the estate's old project manager, the man my father once trusted, and the same man who had vanished after the company's transition to her name. He must have found a copy of the document, waiting for the perfect moment to expose it. Maybe this was his revenge. Maybe it was mine, delivered through fate. The whispers grew louder. Forgery, revision, unfiled deed, estate fraud. She regained her composure quickly, that was her talent, and gave a soft, controlled laugh. The kind designed to reframe panic as misunderstanding. But the room didn't laugh with her, not this time. Eyes that once adored her now examined her. Hands that once applauded her now tightened around champagne glasses. The illusion cracked. She ended the gala early. The orchestra stopped mid-note. Guests shuffled out with polite discomfort, pretending not to know they just witnessed an empire tremble. And as they left, I remained. She turned once in my direction, finally meeting my gaze. No words. Just silence heavy enough to fill the glass walls between us. That night, news traveled faster than her denial. The document had already spread, emails, forums, social media threads dissecting every line of her career. Reporters waited outside the mansion gates by dawn. Carroll inheritance scandal, the headlines read. Philanthropy built on falsehood. Her portrait, once the symbol of elegance, now became the face of deceit. But even as her empire faltered, she didn't collapse. She recalculated. By evening, I received a call from the Carroll Foundation's legal office, not a voice, just a message left by her assistant. A calm instruction for me to attend a private family discussion at home. It wasn't a request. It was an order wrapped in civility. When I arrived, the house was darker than usual, curtains drawn, lights dimmed, the air too quiet. She sat at the head of the dining table, the same table where the sentence that began all this had been spoken. No laughter this time, no audience. Just her, the empire's remains flickering across her phone screen as news outlets dismantled her reputation in real time. Her stillness was terrifying. There was no rage, no panic. Only that perfect sculpted calm she wore when she was about to strike. Though her eyes never left the screen, I could feel the weight of her focus aimed directly at me, not the gaze of a mother, but of a monarch betrayed by her own bloodline. If she could have rewritten me out of existence, she would have. But she no longer held the pen. Later that night, when I returned to my room, I noticed something different. The family portraits that once lined the hallway had been removed. Only one remained, the same one that had hidden my father's letter. But the frame was empty now, the painting gone. That was her warning. A declaration that she was erasing history all over again, starting with memory itself. Still, I wasn't afraid. Because this time she wasn't the only one with reach. Her wealth, her influence, her silence, all of it relied on a network of loyal men and women who believed she could protect them. But once loyalty meets exposure, it dissolves. The next morning, the Board of Trustees released a statement suspending her from leadership pending investigation. Her accounts were frozen. Her properties under review. The same system she had used to crush others now turned inward, methodical and cold. From the outside, the Carroll Foundation looked like it was collapsing. But from within, I could sense something else, a counterstrike building quietly. I checked my phone one evening to find a news alert. Anonymous sources leak allegations against heir. My name. My photo. My forged signatures, the same ones from her shelters, now reframed as my crimes. She hadn't lost control. She had simply changed the battlefield. Within hours, I was no longer the silent victim or the hidden heir. I was the villain. The daughter who had embezzled from her mother's charities, forged family documents, stolen the empire's name. Every lie she'd built for herself, she now draped over me. The court of public opinion turned as fast as applause had once risen. That was her genius, turning pity into defense, exposure into martyrdom. But what she didn't know was that the file she defaked years ago, the medical report declaring my father incompetent, was still in my possession. And it contained the one signature she couldn't explain, her own, written over his doctor's name. She could spin stories, but I held proof. The next day, I met with an investigator, not from the press, but from the Federal Property and Trust Commission. They had already opened an inquiry. When I handed him the documents, his expression changed from curiosity to gravity. The kind of expression that meant something irreversible had just begun. That night, my mother's mansion stood dark again. No laughter, no light, just walls that finally matched their owner. She was still inside, still calculating, still proud. But now, for the first time, she was no longer untouchable. Her empire was no longer an inheritance. It was evidence. The mansion had gone silent. Its corridors, once filled with the rhythm of wealth and control, now echoed only with the sound of things unraveling. The smell of fresh flowers had faded. Even the servants moved differently, quietly, cautiously, like people walking through a church after the sermon has turned to confession. For the first time, my mother's empire wasn't performing. It was hiding. The media had turned its gaze inward, devouring everything with relentless appetite, interviews, rumors, endless analysis of the Carroll scandal. The headlines shifted daily, from betrayal to fraud, from inheritance disputes to emotional abuse. But beneath the noise, a quieter war began, fought not in newsrooms or board meetings, but through files, codes, and whispered names. The Federal Property and Trust Commission had opened a full inquiry. Every account, every transaction, every land transfer tied to Carroll Holdings was now under review. What they found shocked even them. The empire wasn't just corrupt, it was foundational. Whole districts, public works, schools, even hospitals, all connected through decades of shadow contracts. My father had built the structure. My mother had hollowed it from the inside. And now, its collapse threatened to shake more than our family, it threatened the city itself. Each morning I woke to a new revelation. Old allies of my father emerged from silence, engineers, accountants, developers who had once built under the Carroll name before vanishing quietly after his death. Some wanted to help, others wanted to negotiate. But all of them carried fragments of truth, pieces of a puzzle that stretched far beyond one family. One evening, I received an anonymous message, no sender, just an address. If you want to know how deep it goes, come alone. The address led to an abandoned district my father had once planned to redevelop, the Eastmoor complex. A ghost of ambition left half-finished. I drove there under gray skies, past cracked roads and signs that had long lost their letters. The complex stood like a carcass, skeletal steel frames rising from mud, concrete foundations drowned in weeds. Rain dripped through broken roofs, echoing through the hollow space. In the main hall, I found him. An older man, coat-drenched, eyes sharp despite the weight of years. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. His face had appeared in my father's old photographs, a partner from the early years. Someone my mother had called a problem. He handed me a folder, thin but heavy with implication. Inside were maps, contracts, and architectural blueprints, all marked with Carroll Development Authority, a shell division that had supposedly dissolved 15 years ago. But the blueprints told a different story. Underneath the city's newest neighborhoods, beneath parks, apartment blocks, And commercial towers. My father had designed a network of underground vaults. Not metaphorical ones this time. Real ones. Storage chambers, tunnels, private data centers, built into the infrastructure itself. He had designed them to store records, assets, backups, the physical memory of the empire. And when he died, my mother took over those plans. She hadn't destroyed them. She'd repurposed them. According to the man, the vaults were now filled not with files, but with control, literal control. Power lines, server cables, backup energy nodes. The city's newest development zones drew part of their power grid through Carroll Holdings' infrastructure, which meant she didn't just own property. She owned the current that kept the city alive. The man's voice, steady, factual, ghost-like, revealed that the system was being investigated already. The government wanted to nationalize it, but they couldn't until ownership was proven fraudulent. If I had my father's documents, the true will, the signatures, the proof of her manipulation, I could give them the leverage to reclaim it. But if I didn't, she would keep control from the shadows forever. He left as quietly as he appeared, disappearing into the storm. I stood alone in that half-built structure, realizing what kind of inheritance my family had really left me. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't even reputation. It was power that had become infrastructure, and no one person should have ever owned that. Back home, I pulled out my father's will, the trust documents, the forged medical files, laying them across my desk like blueprints to an empire. The more I connected them, the clearer it became. My mother had planned this for years, long before his death. She hadn't killed a man. She had killed a system that refused to serve her. But she had underestimated one thing: legacy remembers. And cities built on lies always keep the sound of what was buried beneath them. As I dug deeper, a new pattern emerged. Every charity, every foundation, every public improvement she sponsored over the years traced back to these underground nodes. Each donation had been a payment, not of compassion but of access. She had built a city that couldn't function without her signature. Even now, with her accounts frozen, the servers and grids ran through contracts she'd written decades ago. She still owned the silence beneath the streets. When I realized that, a strange calm settled over me. She hadn't built an empire out of greed. She had built it out of fear, the fear of ever being powerless again. And now that fear had infected everything. That night, I walked through the mansion again. It felt different now, less like a home, more like a relic. The paintings, the marble floors, the portraits, all illusions of control that no longer worked. In the reflection of a darkened window, I saw my own face framed by that luxury, and for a moment I understood her. She had been what this house demanded, ruthless, perfect, untouchable. And I was what it had accidentally created, the proof that perfection always breaks. The next morning, investigators arrived with warrants. I stood at the top of the staircase, watching as they carried out boxes of files, servers, and sealed envelopes. The air filled with the sound of paper and truth being uprooted. My mother didn't appear. Her bedroom door stayed closed. But I knew she was listening. By evening, the house was half empty, its silence heavy, its power fading. The investigators thanked me politely, their faces careful, professional, but beneath their restraint was a quiet understanding. The city's most powerful woman had fallen, and her daughter had helped dismantle her. When they left, I returned to my father's study. The bookshelves were bare now, thus showing where volumes once stood. The space looked smaller, but lighter, like it had finally exhaled. I sat at his desk, opening the final page of his old ledger. It contained a single note, written in his hand. Every structure carries its shadow. The only question is, who will stand in it? Outside, the city lights flickered. I thought of the vaults beneath those lights, humming, unseen, waiting. Somewhere below, power still ran through her circuits. Even in ruin, she controlled the current. And if I wanted to end her legacy completely, I would have to go where it lived, underground. Later that night, I received another message. No name, no greeting. Just a short line. Vault coordinates, north grid. Block C, bring the key. The key. My father's brass key, the one I'd found hidden behind his portrait, the one she'd never managed to take. It was time to finish what both of them had started. As I packed my things, I took one last look at the mansion, its windows glowing faintly, its symmetry still pretending to matter. It would stand for years, even after the truth of who built it was forgotten. But I knew better. It wasn't built from stone or steel, it was built from lies, cemented with silence. And silence, once broken, never rebuilds the same. I stepped outside into the wind, the sky gray and endless. The house loomed behind me like a confession carved into marble. Ahead the city waited, unaware that its veins pulsed with one family's ambition. For the first time, I didn't look back, because what waited underground wasn't history anymore. It was inheritance, and it was mine to unearth. The coordinates led her to the city's industrial edge, a district that never slept, where cranes hunched like tired giants and the smell of iron hung thick in the air. Beneath it ran the oldest part of the power grid, the invisible bloodstream that kept lights burning across towers built on Carol land. If the rumors were true, the grid wasn't public. It belonged to her family, it always had. By dusk, she stood before a rust-colored gate marked maintenance access only. Rain slid down its bars like sweat on steel. She pressed the brass key into a small slot hidden behind a corroded panel. The metal clicked once, then again. The gate opened inward with a hiss of stale air. A narrow stairway spiraled downward. Each step moaned beneath her weight, as if protesting the return of its own bloodline. At the bottom waited a corridor lit by dim amber bulbs. The air was colder here, charged, metallic, alive. Pipes lined the walls like arteries pulsing faint warmth. Somewhere deeper, machinery hummed, steady, rhythmic like a heartbeat. She walked slowly, tracing her hand along the rough concrete. Graffiti scarred the walls, but beneath the layers of paint she saw the faded imprint of letters, CEG Infrastructure Division. Carroll Estate Group. Her father's initials had once stood for progress, now they were fossilized in dust. The corridor split into 3 tunnels. To the left, the sound of water. To the right, a faint vibration. Straight ahead, silence. She chose the silence. After 50 yards, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber, circular, cathedral-like, lined with consoles and glowing monitors that flickered with blue light. At its center rose a glass cylinder filled with humming servers stacked floor to ceiling. On the glass, etched faintly, were the same initials again, CEG. Her father's empire hadn't died, it had evolved. Data scrolled across one monitor, property grids, energy readings, digital signatures. Each neighborhood her mother had developed appeared as a glowing cluster on the screen, all connected through a single central node, Vault 7. The same name from her mother's hidden file. It wasn't a metaphor, it was the network's core. She approached the console, the hum vibrating through the solace of her shoes. A prompt blinked. Access key required. She placed the brass key into a narrow slot on the side. The system recognized it instantly, as if welcoming her home. The monitors flared alive. Blueprints of the city unfolded in layers, streets, sewers, power lines, fiber routes, all feeding into the Carroll grid. Every circuit carried a watermark, property of Carroll Holdings. Her mother had privatized the city's pulse. Every hospital light, every elevator, every traffic signal depended on her permission to breathe. She scrolled through the interface, uncovering folders labeled billing, control, security, failsafe. When she opened failsafe, a warning appeared. Manual override will trigger system reset and asset purge. Proceed? Beneath it, a single line of text, written years ago by her father. No empire should survive its corruption. Her breath caught. It wasn't just a power grid, it was a moral device. He had built a self-destruct, a way to collapse the system if it ever fell into the wrong hands. And it had. For a long moment she stood still, the glow of the monitors washing her face in cold light. Destroying the network would mean erasing her mother's empire, but also her father's life as work. It would plunge the city into chaos. Hospitals would falter, lights would die, transit would stop. But if she left it intact, the corruption would outlive them all. Behind her, a faint sound, footsteps, measured, certain. She didn't turn. She didn't have to. The air itself told her who it was. Her mother's perfume carried differently in underground air, less floral, more chemical. A reminder that even beauty can poison if left long enough in the dark. The footsteps stopped a few paces away. No words, no accusation. Just the sound of her breathing, steady, deliberate, like someone watching a reflection they no longer recognized. She reached for the console. Her mother moved closer. Still, neither spoke. 2 generations of control stood inches apart, each born from the same ambition, each carrying the same curse. On the screen, the warning still blinked. Proceed with system reset. Yen. She looked once more at the words etched by her father. No empire should survive its corruption. Then she pressed Y. The chamber erupted in sound, a low rising hum that filled every pipe, every wall. The lights flickered. The servers began to pulse faster. Alarms echoed through the tunnels, red strobes painting the walls like veins of fire. Her mother stepped back, hand shielding her face from the glare. The floor trembled. The network began to collapse. Data cascaded across the monitors, property records, contracts, bank files, all erasing in waves of white light. Everything the Caros had ever built, digitized or stolen, gone. Above ground, neighborhoods would flicker as backup grids rerouted control. The city would survive, but the empire would die. She turned toward her mother, whose eyes shone not with rage but with disbelief, the shock of watching power finally leave her body. For decades, she had ruled through ownership. Now ownership itself was dissolving. The tremor subsided. The alarms slowed, fading to a low mechanical sigh. One by one, the screens dimmed until only a single message remained, projected across the glass cylinder: purge complete. System restored to public grid. Silence followed, a silence that felt clean. The chamber no longer hummed, it breathed. Her mother sank into a nearby chair, the gown that once symbolized dominance now drenched in sweat and dust. She looked smaller, human, defeated. For the first time, she had nothing left to control. The daughter turned off the final switch. The lights above flickered once, then steadied. New power, public power, running on the city's own lines. Her father's failsafe had worked. The corruption had ended exactly the way he designed it, with his bloodline. When she climbed back to the surface, dawn was breaking over the skyline. The city glowed softer, less artificial, as though the storm had washed the glass clean. Traffic lights blinked normally, windows lit one by one. Life continued, unaware that its veins had just been rewritten. Behind her, sirens approached, investigators, technicians, journalists, drawn by the tremor that had rippled through the grid. By the time they reached the site, she was gone. From a distant hill, she watched the sun rise over the towers her family had built. They looked different now, not symbols of dominance but monuments to endurance. The empire was dead, but the city lived. And that, she realized, was the truest inheritance she could leave behind. Morning rose with the color of glass and smoke. The skyline shimmered as if nothing had happened, but the city knew. It always knew when power changed hands, not in speeches or reports, but in the way light moved across windows that had once belonged to someone else. The Caro name was gone from every office plaque, every charity brochure, every property registry, erased within hours of the purge. The servers that had hummed for decades under her mother's control were dark now, their data turned to dust. For the first time, the city breathed on its own current. Yet silence can't erase history. It only gives it room to echo. News coverage filled the airwaves, cautious phrases like unprecedented revelation, and systemic collapse. They called it a power realignment, never daring to name it for what it was, a dynasty undone by its own daughter. In the eyes of the world, she had destroyed an empire, but in her own eyes, she had set it free. Still, freedom carried a strange weight. The mansion that once felt suffocating now felt hollow. Every sound, the creak of a stair, the flutter of curtains, the whisper of wind through the garden, carried the ghost of what used to be. There was no staff now, no events, no laughter crafted for cameras, just quiet. And the quiet spoke loudly. In her father's study, dust floated through sunlight like tiny confessions. The ledgers, the files, the walls themselves, everything had been cleared out by investigators. Only one thing remained untouched. The painting frame that had once hidden her father's letter. She had never put the portrait back. It didn't belong there anymore. On the empty wall, faint outlines of its edges lingered, a ghost of the past that refused to fade. She sat at the desk where it all began. The wood felt colder now, stripped of illusion. In front of her lay a single document, a formal notice from the Property Commission, offering her control of what was left of the Carroll estate, land holdings, shares, patents. The empire could live again, this time legally. All she had to do was sign. She didn't. She let the paper sit, untouched, as sunlight crawled across the ink. Her father had built a system of ownership. Her mother had perfected it. But ownership was never the cure. It had always been the disease. Outside, the garden was overgrown. The roses her mother once trimmed with surgical precision now grew wild, climbing past the fences and spilling into the road beyond. For the first time they looked alive. She walked through the rows slowly, the thorns catching her sleeves, the scent heavy and real. The estate behind her looked less like a monument and more like what it truly was, a mausoleum built for pride. Every inch of it designed to immortalize a family that could never stay human. And yet, beneath all that ruin, something had survived. Her father's designs, the underground grid, had been absorbed into the city's new system. Engineers were reworking his architecture to serve public infrastructure. Hospitals, schools, emergency systems, all would run on his blueprint now, free of her mother's name. It was his redemption, delivered through her hands. Weeks passed. The media found new scandals to feed on. The Carrolls faded from headlines and entered legend. People spoke of them as myth, a story about greed and redemption, about a family that owned the city's soul until it owned them. She listened sometimes, quietly, as strangers debated whether the daughter had been a hero or a traitor. Neither title mattered. Truth didn't need applause, it only needed air. One afternoon, she received a small parcel with no return address. Inside was a single item, a worn flash drive. No note, no explanation. Only a label, faded and handwritten. Vault 8. Her pulse stilled. Vault 7 had been the core. Vault 8 shouldn't exist. But if it did, it meant her mother had prepared one final move. She plugged it in cautiously. The screen flickered, then revealed a single file, Continuity Protocol. Inside, a digital blueprint of the same city she had just freed, except this version glowed differently. Not infrastructure, influence. A web of trusts, corporations, shell companies, all under new names. The Carroll system hadn't died, it had relocated. Transferred quietly over the years into successor entities, new faces, new owners. The empire had learned to survive by shedding its skin. At the bottom of the document was a familiar signature. Not her mother's, her brother's. The realization hit like static. He hadn't vanished after the scandal. He had inherited what she destroyed, the way a seed inherits the soil from a burned tree. Her mother had planned it that way. The empire was never meant to die with her. It was meant to adapt. For a long time, she just stared at the screen. The city outside her window glittered, innocent in its ignorance. Somewhere in those lights, her brother was building again, using her silence as foundation. She closed the laptop and leaned back, feeling the weight of choice return. Destroying the system once had cost her everything. To do it again would require something greater than proof. It would require purpose. In that moment, she understood what her father meant when he wrote, "Every structure carries its shadow." The empire was that shadow. And no matter how much light you poured into it, the outline would remain. That night, she drove through the city, through districts her family had built, past towers that still whispered their name in their wiring. She stopped on a bridge overlooking the skyline. Wind moved through her hair, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt. The lights below shimmered like a heartbeat, steady, eternal. She realized she couldn't destroy every shadow, but she could choose not to live in one. In the weeks that followed, she sold what was left of the estate. The mansion, the land, even the gardens, all transferred to public trusts. Each piece turned into something open. The study became a museum for urban architecture. The ballroom became a community hall. The gardens, once manicured to perfection, were left wild on purpose, renamed Carroll Meadow, a reminder that control isn't creation. She vanished quietly after that. No press conference, no farewell. Just silence. The kind that follows when a storm ends, not because everything is healed, but because the world finally knows it survived. Months later, a new rumor began circulating. Someone was buying up small properties across the outskirts, not luxury estates, but abandoned lots, old schools, disused hospitals. Each one registered under a new name, a name no one recognized. Amber Vale Foundation. The initials matched her father's middle name. Only a few noticed, and those who did smiled quietly. Because some inherit empires, and others inherit the will to rebuild what empires ruin. Years passed. The city healed itself the way concrete does after a crack, not perfectly, but with a kind of stubborn endurance. The Carroll scandal had become an old story, archived in dusty headlines and forgotten databases. People moved on. Markets rose again. Developments resumed. But history, like foundation, never truly disappears. It just hides beneath new floors. Out on the city's southern rim, cranes rose again against the skyline. A new corporation's banners flapped in the wind, clean, modern, confident. Lowell Urban Group. The name meant nothing to most, but to those who knew the Carroll bloodline it was a ghost reborn. Lowell had been their mother's maiden name. And behind that facade stood her son. He had returned quietly, wearing humility like armor. To the public, he was the man who wanted to rebuild what corruption had destroyed. To the powerful, he was the man who knew exactly where the buried circuits lay. And to her, his sister, he was the echo of everything she had tried to erase. From her distance, she watched the rise through news clippings and city filings. Each project he launched followed a familiar pattern: redevelopment in neglected districts, rebranding old Carroll properties under new identities, reinstating the same flow of capital that once poisoned the veins of the city. He didn't need to claim the empire. He only needed to imitate its rhythm. The Amber Vale Foundation she had built in anonymity worked in the opposite direction, restoring what the system ignored. Small schools, public housing, parks grown from ruins. While his cranes reached upward, hers reached outward. Two legacies growing from the same soil, one for control, one for release. But she knew the pattern too well to trust the calm. Ambition never rests. It waits. The first collision came quietly, an acquisition notice for an old hospital site, one her foundation had just begun to restore. The land, it turned out, had been bought 2 months earlier by Lowell Urban Group through a shell intermediary. Her permit was revoked within a week. The reason cited, infrastructural conflict. She didn't fight it publicly. She knew how public battles ended, with distraction, not victory. Instead, she began tracing paperwork. The same old web unfolded again: trusts, holding firms, anonymous investors. And at the heart of it, a signature she knew by memory. Her brother's. He had inherited more than their mother's cunning. He had inherited her instinct for erasure. The realization came without surprise. Legacy isn't learned, it's absorbed. You inherit it in the pauses of your breath, in the way you sign your name. She spent nights studying his new empire. It was cleaner, more polished. The corruption was buried deeper, wrapped in language so modern it felt righteous. Urban renewal, sustainability, community investment. Every contract was a mirror of the old ones, just rewritten in the grammar of the present. Even the corruption had evolved. And then came the invitations to conferences, panels, industry events, all bearing the same tagline, Shaping the Future, Lowell Urban and the Amber Veil Initiative. He was merging her name into his narrative, folding her ideals into his brand. She had become his alibi. It was then she understood. The new war wasn't over property, it was over meaning. Who would define what the Caro name had left behind, the one who destroyed it or the one who reimagined it? In public, the city loved him. He gave speeches about legacy and progress, about honoring his father's blueprint and his mother's courage. Every time he spoke those words, he rewrote her story into his script. The world believed it gladly. People prefer redemption to truth. But truth doesn't disappear, it waits for light. The deeper she looked, the more she found. Lowell Urban Group wasn't simply a company. It was a reclamation engine, buying back everything she had released, piece by piece, converting her open trusts into private developments. Each project carried a clause that allowed government subsidies to flow back into controlled hands. The empire wasn't rising again. It was resurrecting through her brother's pen. At night, she drove through his newest project, the Haven District. The name made her pause. It was her mother's old word, recycled and polished. Wide boulevards, glass facades, fountains that reflected the city's glow. It looked beautiful. But beneath the surface, the same buried grid hummed faintly. She could feel it, the echo of her father's design. The same energy lines reactivated, the same shadow running beneath a different architecture. She parked her car near the entrance gate, watching the new security lights blink in rhythm. It struck her that her family's curse had never been greed. It was the refusal to let go. Her brother had grown into a new kind of power, the kind that smiled instead of commanded. He had learned from their mother's downfall, appear clean, sound humble. But own everything quietly. Weeks passed before she made her move. One night, she visited the city's planning archives, the same place where her father's blueprints once rested. It was near empty, silent except for the hum of lights. There, she found what she was looking for, a series of old zoning applications connected to Lowell Urban Group. Each contained digital signatures. Her brother's, yes, but attached to an authorization code that wasn't his. The code belonged to her. The system still recognized her as heir of the Caro Estate Group. He had been signing under her authority, through access she didn't even know she still had. He wasn't just rebuilding the empire. He was building it in her name. It was a perfect cycle. Their mother had stolen from their father, and now the son has stolen from the sister. The empire didn't die. It mutated. Standing in that dim archive, she realized something else. Every signature left a trail, no matter how hidden. And trails, like foundations, are built to bear weight. When she left, dawn was breaking again. The streets were quiet, the sky pale. She drove past one of his construction sites, a tower skeleton rising over the skyline, its unfinished glass glinting like memory. Workers moved like ghosts below, unaware they were building a resurrection. For a moment, she stopped the car and watched the light hit the steel. It shimmered with all the beauty and danger of legacy. She understood then that she couldn't destroy this empire with exposure. That had already been done once. It had to be undone through something else, transformation. She looked at the empty passenger seat beside her, the documents stacked there. Blueprints, contracts, her brother's forged authorizations. Evidence again. But this time, she didn't feel like the daughter avenging the past. She felt like the architect of a new kind of justice, one that doesn't punish but replaces. Power, she realized, doesn't vanish when destroyed. It just waits for someone brave enough to rebuild it differently. Construction began like a pulse in steel. Every morning, the sound of drills echoed through the city, rhythmic, relentless, alive. The Hayden Tower rose floor by floor above the skyline, its glass skin catching sunlight like a blade. People called it the symbol of rebirth. To her, it was a tombstone built from memory. The site sat directly above the oldest Carroll foundations, the same grid her father designed decades ago, the one she thought she'd freed. Now her brother was building on its bones. She had thought she'd ended the empire. But the empire, like concrete, had multiple layers. She had shattered the visible one, not the roots beneath. And the roots, she realized, were alive. Through contacts in the planning department, she gained access to the tower's base schematics. The blueprints looked ordinary at first, modern, efficient, clean. But beneath level B2, she noticed something strange, a blank section, no measurements. No details. Just a note in the margin. Legacy chamber restricted. The handwriting wasn't her brother's, it was their father's. He had drawn this decades ago, hidden beneath the city before either of them understood what inheritance meant. And her brother had found it. He was building directly over it, not by accident, but by design. Late one night, she entered the construction site under the cover of rain. The guards didn't notice her. The cameras, newly installed, still looped on old feeds. She descended through unfinished floors, her footsteps echoing off steel and dust. At level B2, she found a sealed hatch. Rust along its hinges suggested age far beyond the tower's timeline. She pried it open and stepped into the dark. The air changed immediately, colder, older, weighted. Her flashlight beam cut across a narrow stairway spiraling downward. Each step sank deeper into the past, the echo of her breath mixing with the hum of machines buried for half a century. At the bottom lay a long corridor, smooth concrete, untouched by time. Symbols were carved faintly into the walls, a pattern of circles intersecting lines, like veins or constellations. And at the far end, a heavy metal door with a symbol she recognized, CEG, her father's mark. She pressed her hand against the surface. It felt warm, alive. When she searched the edges, she found a small indentation, circular, brass-lined. She reached into her coat and withdrew the old key, the one that had opened the first vault. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked once, then twice. The door opened inward. Inside, the room was vast and silent. Rows of lights flickered to life as she stepped in, revealing what looked like a subterranean archive, not digital this time, but physical. Walls lined with shelves of rolled blueprints, notebooks, ledgers, reels of film, even models of early city layouts. It wasn't a vault for money or power, it was a vault for knowledge. And at the center stood a single table, her father's drafting desk, preserved exactly as she remembered it. On it rested a model of the entire city, carved from glass and metal. Each building shimmered faintly, powered by a soft internal light. It was a map of the city not as it existed, but as it could exist, every structure balanced against another. Every district interconnected through harmony, not control. It was his final vision, the Carroll Empire reimagined as a city that no one could own. But beneath the model's foundation, she noticed another layer, darker, hidden beneath removable glass. When she lifted it, she found a compartment containing a thick binder labeled Continuity Protocol 2, Last Revision. Inside were blueprints, annotated in her father's handwriting, detailed diagrams of the power grid, infrastructure, and a final set of instructions. If you are reading this, it means the first failsafe has been triggered. The city must not belong to a family. It must belong to its people, but human nature repeats. Power rebuilds itself in new names. So I built one final safeguard. Beneath the note was a schematic, one she didn't recognize. It wasn't a network or a vault. It was a mirror system. A second grid, dormant, buried even deeper than the first. capable of absorbing control from any system that replicated the original Carol code. Her brother's empire had been built using that code. Every digital signature, every structure, every circuit carried it, which meant that if activated, this final failsafe could transfer control of his entire network instantly. Not to her. Not to anyone. To the city itself. The design was brilliant, not revenge, not preservation, but liberation encoded into architecture. Her father had built a system that could never again be privately owned. And her brother, unaware, had been reconstructing the mechanism of his own undoing. As she stood there, surrounded by blueprints and ghosts, she felt the strange peace of inevitability. Her father had foreseen this, his children's opposite natures, their inheritance of ambition and remorse. He hadn't trusted either of them to win. So he had given the final victory to something greater, the place they both loved and betrayed. On the far wall, a control console waited, old, mechanical, but functional, a slot for the same brass key. Next to it, a switch labeled Release Protocol. She hesitated only once. Activating it would erase all private ownership of the grid, including her foundation systems, her funding, even the remnants of her own work. It would make the city truly free, but leave her with nothing. Everything her bloodline had ever built would dissolve into public trust. The Caro name would become history, not power. But maybe that was the point. She placed the key in the slot. The console hummed, gears shifting beneath metal. Lights across the chamber flickered to life, casting her reflection across the glass model of the city. The map glowed, each building lighting up in sequence, like a pulse spreading across a sleeping body. Then, silence. A low chime sounded. The control panel displayed 3 words. Protocol active. Ownership reassigned. Above ground, invisible to the world, the system changed. Every deed, every patent, every property once tied to Carol or Lowell Urban quietly transferred into a neutral trust governed by public code. No single name could claim it again. The empire had ended, finally, in peace. She stepped back, watching the lights dim one by one until the room was dark again. The city above would never know what had happened. It would simply wake lighter, freer, unaware that the ghosts had finally let go. At the far end of the chamber, a second door stood open, a passage leading upward, toward daylight. She followed it, ascending slowly through layers of stone and shadow until the echo of machinery faded behind her. When she emerged, she stood inside the skeleton of the Haven Tower. The wind moved through its beams like breath through ribs. Dawn was rising beyond the cranes. She looked back once, not in regret, but in gratitude. Her father had built a city. Her mother had tried to own it. Her brother had tried to reclaim it. And she had finally set it free. The Carol bloodline had ended not with inheritance, but with release. Morning broke across the skyline like forgiveness. The city stretched under pale sunlight, unaware that in the span of a single night, its ownership had shifted, not from one name to another, but from control to freedom. The grid hummed softly beneath the streets, independent now, self-governing, unowned. The system no longer answered to signatures or authority. It answered only to balance. Somewhere above that invisible revolution, the cranes at Haven Tower stood still. Construction had halted. The investors had vanished overnight, their contracts voided, their accounts unreachable. Every document carrying the Lowell Urban Group seal now read a single phrase in digital ink: transfer complete, public domain. The city didn't panic. It adjusted. Lights stayed on. Trains still moved. People still went to work, unaware that their world had quietly reclaimed itself. But one man knew. And his silence weighed heavier than ruin. Her brother stood in his office on the unfinished top floor of the tower. The glass walls surrounded him with a panoramic view of everything their family had ever owned. The city glimmered below, the living consequence of generations of ambition. But on his monitors, numbers turned red, access codes failed, control dissolved line by line. He had inherited the empire only to watch it fade like smoke between his fingers. For hours, he searched for the fault, a breach, a hack, a betrayal. But the truth was simpler, older. It wasn't stolen. It was released, and deep down he knew who had done it. Across the city, she stood at the riverbank, watching sunlight dance on the surface. The wind carried the smell of steel and rain, the scent of a city reborn. She didn't feel triumph. She felt closure, the slow, quiet kind that doesn't celebrate, only breathes. The Carroll legacy was gone, dissolved into the architecture of the world it once tried to own. For the first time, no one controlled it, no signatures, no seals, no heirs. Freedom had no last name. As the morning deepened, the city's news cycle began to murmur. Reporters spoke of technical anomalies, unexplained data transfers, a massive redistribution of property titles. But no one connected it to the Carrolls. The world had already forgotten them. Their empire was history now, a cautionary tale written into urban folklore. People remembered the scandal, not the structure. And maybe that was mercy. Back at the tower, her brother descended the unfinished stairwell, the echo of his footsteps following him down like ghosts. At the base level, construction lights flickered, casting fractured patterns across concrete. He paused near the sealed hatch that led to the vault she had opened hours before. It was still warm. The keyhole glowed faintly, as if remembering the hand that had turned it. He touched the metal surface, and in that brief contact, something inside him shifted, a memory, a fracture, a quiet understanding. He realized that his sister hadn't destroyed what was his. She had completed what their father began. The empire was never meant to survive them. It was meant to outgrow them. For the first time, he felt the weight of that truth, not as loss, but as release. Outside, the wind carried the sound of hammers from distant construction sites. New projects already beginning under different names. Progress didn't pause for legacy. It simply built over it. The city would remember the Carrolls not through wealth, but through structure, the bones of rows, the pattern of neighborhoods, the quiet hum of systems that worked because someone finally stopped trying to own them. Days turned to weeks. The tower remained unfinished, a monument to ambition left intentionally incomplete. Investors called it a loss. The public called it art, but she understood what it truly was, a reminder. Some architectures are meant to remain unfinished so that perfection never becomes control again. She spent her days quietly, far from the mansion, living in a small apartment overlooking the same streets her family once ruled. Sometimes she walked past places that still carried the old name on faded plaques: Carroll Square, Margaret Gardens, Amberwood Residences. She never corrected them. Erasure wasn't necessary. Let the ghosts remain. They taught the city how to grow. Every evening, as lights flickered on across the skyline, she felt the city breathe, steady, equal, self-sustaining. For the first time in its history, its pulse belonged to no one. And in that shared heartbeat, she heard her father's voice again, the one that had whispered through blueprints and silence alike. No empire should survive its corruption. He had been right. And now, his words had become the foundation of something purer, not empire, but equilibrium. Her brother eventually left the city. No one knew where he went. Some said he went abroad to start again. Others said he stayed, living quietly under another name. Maybe both were true. It didn't matter. He had learned what every Carroll eventually did, that power is never permanent, and that peace arrives only when you stop chasing it.